This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Paul C. Taylor, who teaches in the Department of Philosophy at University of California, Los Angeles. In addition to a number of scholarly essays and edited collections on philosophy and the question of race, he is the author of Race, A Philosophical Introduction from 2003, On Obama from 2015, and Black is Beautiful, A Philosophy of Black Aesthetics from 2016. He is currently at work on two book-length projects, Dark Futures and Uneasy Sanctuary, Rethinking Race Thinking. In this conversation, we discussed the place of philosophical thinking in the study of Black life, critical theory as a form of Black study, and the intersection of aesthetic questions and critical theories of race in the field of Black studies. Good afternoon, Paul. How are you today?
I'm doing okay, man. How are you?
I'm all right. We're recording this second week of January. I got a couple weeks here before the semester starts, so deep in denial about the start of work again. But
I understand.
We all go through these phases. But I'm very excited that we have a chance to talk today. I'm glad you made time to contribute to the podcast. I think your voice on this series is going to be really interesting and a really important one to have. I really love your work. I have a philosophy PhD, and so having philosophers on the podcast is always a special treat for me, I have to say. And so all to say, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Thanks for your time ahead of time, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be a part of this great series. People whose work I admire and respect, including you, have been part of this enterprise, and I'm honored to follow in their footsteps.
Well, you will definitely have a good footsteps in those footsteps. So we'll have a chance to talk about your work and how you think about it in relation to the study of Black life and all those sorts of questions that come with that, how you imagine Black study and Black studies, its political and intellectual significance. But I wanted to start off with really a more personal question, more intimate question, which is, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies in this philosophical mode? And for me, always a companion question, what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Good. Thank you so much for the question. The second part's way easier to answer than the first part. What sustains me is just the vibrancy, the beauty, the vitality of various expressions of Black life. I mean, I grew up in a certain version of it, and I'll speak to that in a second. But, I have a group of people. I suspect a lot of people have something like this since the pandemic, right? I have a group of people that has become more tight-knit online than it probably otherwise would have been had it not been for the pandemic, and we had a book club and all that. And, every once in a while, one of us will just send a video of something or audio file or something and just say, I love Black people. Because it's something so wonderful that just shows people finding ways to find joy or beauty or serenity or space or whatever it is sometimes under challenging conditions. Sometimes it's not even about responding to challenging conditions. This is one of the lessons we've learned from Kevin Quashie's work, right? Black life isn't always about pushing back against stuff, but we'll just send a thing around, I love Black people. And that's one of the things that sustains me, because it's one of the things about Black life and culture, inhabiting it and studying it, that comes through so clearly, and that gives me resources for, just keeping on. So that's the second part's easy. That's what sustains me. The first part, I'm sorry, remind me. I got so caught up. I was thinking in particular of a video. I'm thinking of the Nicholas Brothers video. A lot of people have seen this, I'm sure. Just that snippet of them doing this remarkable dance. So I was thinking about that, and I lost track of the question. Give me the first part again.
Yeah, what drew you to study Black life?
Oh, yeah. So I am generationally what Mark Anthony Neal once invited us to call a post-soul baby, right? So my life is pretty much pretty much maps neatly onto the post-segregation era. And so I grew up with parents who didn't have any idea how to navigate the world I was in because they grew up under segregation. And I was trying to figure stuff out in a world that was newly segregated in all sorts of ways. And had a really uneven relationship to Black culture. My parents had a kind of organic relationship to it that didn't require a great deal of curation or cultivation because they were immersed in it, because they had to be. And so it didn't occur to them that it would take effort to help me establish a relationship to the things that they took for granted. And so it was uneven. And then when it came time for me to go to college, I went to a predominantly white high school. I went to predominantly white schools coming up and all that, because this was opportunity to my parents, right? We are no longer tethered to these particular spaces. This is what progress looks like, all of that. And so when it came time to go to college, I was like, okay, well, I guess this is the path I'm on. I'll go to Oberlin or I'll go to whatever. And my dad was like, yeah, that's nice. You're going to Morehouse. Because I went to Morehouse and your brother went to Morehouse and your mom went to Spelman, and this is how it's going to be. And so I went to Morehouse and got the crash course in Black life that I didn't know I needed and didn't know I wanted. I kind of knew I wanted it. I didn't know I needed it. But I got that crash course at a moment in a context of people who were navigating the same peculiar post-soul, post-civil rights moment that I just described. Mm-hmm. And so, this is people I was part of a community of people who were trying to figure out what it meant to be Black in this moment, and whose resources were weirdly curated by this institution that takes great pride in cultivating a certain vision of Black masculinity, but didn't, at least at the time, think very hard about how much that vision of Black masculinity was bound up with a certain kind of class sensibility and the reproduction of certain kinds of bourgeois elites or something, right? And so I ended up in lots of arguments with people about what Blackness meant and whether it had to be tethered to the things that certain parts of Morehouse wanted it to be tethered to. I say certain parts because there were other parts, right? There were refugees or holdovers from what we still sometimes call the Civil Rights Movement, and certain parts of it, like Willie Ricks, who at that time was called Mukasa, who were circulating on the boundaries of the sort of respectable Morehouse political education, reminding us there were other ways, right? There were what we would soon call decolonial ways of thinking about this stuff. There were more radical ways of thinking about this stuff, ways connected to various kinds of socialist movements. And so there were lots of things happening. And so there were these tensions and fissures, and I found myself in arguments with people about how to navigate and how to position yourself with respect to all of that. And in part because of that, I discovered that my basic orientation to questions like that is philosophical. And so I became a philosopher. But the thing that helped me see that, and the thing that encouraged me to explore that, was the importance and the pressing nature of these questions about Black life at a particular moment. So my introduction to philosophy and my introduction to the thoroughgoing systematic study of Black life kind of happened at the same time. Mm-hmm. And each kind of fed the other.
It's interesting to hearing you talk about I don't know how else to put it, but like the event of Morehouse education, right? Which is not the classroom, it's not the major alone. It's also this, the kinds of questions that are both endemic to the institution, but also particular to that generation. I mean, it reminds me, just as an intra podcast reference, talking with Michael Gillespie in his episode about being at Morehouse. And he said, I never actually formally studied Black studies, but being at Morehouse was a Black studies education.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Both in the classroom and outside the classroom, and how that connected him to the field in a way that wasn't actually naming the field as like an institutional entity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a powerful and important insight. It's very true. Of course, Morehouse did not have a Black studies program when I was there. Had you even raised it with anyone, they would say, what are you talking about? The whole thing is Black studies, right? But it was Black studies in this really interesting way, in part because large chunks of the institution resisted anything that would be recognizable as Black studies, mm-hmm. right? Some of it, lots of it didn't. And the whole point of the institution is to give people the resources to navigate a certain, or to inhabit a certain, to realize, to discern, to realize, and live in a certain vision of Black life. But that vision refused other visions in ways that made some of the arguments that you find in and around Black Studies department part of the life of the space, right? So I think about, one of the things people know, some people, if they don't know anything else about Morehouse, they know about the Morehouse Glee Club, right? Which is a glee club in the spirit of the Fish Jubilee singers from the 19th century and all that, right? And goes around the country and every year and does this great tour and does fundraising and all that. And I don't know if this is still happening. I doubt it, but maybe it is. There were these arguments around the music department there, and by extension around the Glee Club, over what was appropriate, what were the appropriate conventions for vocal musical performance in the Glee Club setting, right? And anything that smacked of post, like 1950 gospel music was all out of bounds, right? That's not what we do here, right? So you can't do that kind of vibrato. You can't do these improvisatory blues riff bass runs, right? That's not what we do here, right? And for some people, that stuff is the essence of Black life. And so you have this thing that's expressly and vigorously imagined as quintessentially Black that refuses some other things that some people think of as quintessentially. And that's at the heart of the exercise. And so it was this interesting immersion in not just a kind of practice of Black study, but an immersion in the controversies and the intellectual tensions around Black studies in a Black space. It was super interesting.
Yeah, that's a fascinating example. It does feel pulled right out of the last chapter of Souls of Black Folk, right? The way of thinking about the spirituals, and as you said, so emphasis on vocal style, as a debate about epistemology and ontology, really. It's about authenticity, which is not just a cultural pride trope or some sort of one-dimensional or two-dimensional thing. I mean, every dimension is in that question as you put it and staged it. Yeah, that'd make a fascinating book, actually. So
yeah,
you should go write.
Someone may have written it. Especially nowadays in the wake of the rise of sonic studies and near Black studies. But yeah, it was a question about what is essential to Blackness and what is accidental, right? All of this stuff that you people who grew up listening to Aretha Franklin think is essential, that's not the real stuff, right? We know what the real stuff is, and it ain't that. Which is super interesting because one of the people who comes out of that context is Byron Cage, who's now a towering figure as a gospel singer, right? He had to build a relationship to that department. And I didn't know him well enough to know what that looked like for him, but it clearly did not impair him. Anyway, that's one example. There are others.
Yeah. Well, let me sort of pick up on that and ask you about this idea of Black studies and Black study. I want to ask, so what is the portrait that you work with? What is the sort of idea of Black studies and Black study that you have in your mind as you do this sort of work? And I ask this in the context of the origin of the field in the late 1960s and early 1970s, where you had this tension built in to the moment, which was the demand by students on campuses that there be somewhere to study Black life, that disciplines traditionally had not given sufficient, if any at all, attention to Black history, Black literature, etc. And so that demand and the success of that demand, locating that intellectual life in a Black studies department, I think lives on in this notion of Black studies as an intellectual endeavor. right? The sort of history and future of ideas. But of course, at that time in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that's the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where these kinds of distinctions we might make between, a book and political action, between a classroom and a community, between study and prescriptive mobilization, were really blurred, if not outright obliterated. And so I think there's still that tension, even, 50 something years later in Black studies, between the political demands of the field, a certain commitment to liberation struggle on certain kinds of terms, and a commitment to intellectual life. And I say a tension because I don't know that it's a contradiction, but there's certainly a tension there that I think everybody in Black studies, and I think anyone for whom the study of Black life is at the center of their work, sort of grapples with. And so I'm interested to hear sort of how you think about Black study and Black studies, sort of in that, sort of lightly shaped by the context of its origin.
Good, good. I will confess to you, John. I don't have a settled answer to this yet. Or now, I shouldn't say yet. For a couple of reasons that I'll try to make articulate. One is that I have not maybe three reasons. One is boring. It's just I've recently moved to UCLA. We're still in transition. Moving is hard, and I haven't had the cognitive bandwidth to think hard about a lot of things. And so I would have different views if my life were different. So that's one. Two is I approach these questions and questions like them from a perch in the higher ed sector, and the higher ed sector has been undergoing all kinds of changes, and some of these bear on the work of Black studies and all of that. So that's all in flux. I'm figuring that looks like. The third thing is I'm not currently in a Black studies department or Black studies cognate department. I've just moved, not just, but recently moved to UCLA, and people who work in the academy will know how this sometimes goes. You want to get the lay of the land before you start building connections to other units and all that. So I'm just squarely in the philosophy department. And I haven't had a robust connection to a Black studies or Black studies cognate department in a while. I was part of the founding of the current iteration of the African American and Diaspora Studies program at Penn State, but that was a good long while ago. And so I haven't had to engage with these questions in the way that would require a settled view on these things. So all of that was a very long caveat. So I often still start thinking about these kinds of questions through the lens that Manning Marable gave us. It was 1998, I think, and the arguments with Skip Gates. And in that context, he made public to New York Times readers a formulation that he had used elsewhere, talked about Black studies being corrective, descriptive, and prescriptive, right? And I think all of that's a very valuable way to think about what's happening, or a valuable way to think about the enterprise. But the value of that approach can only fully be realized if we think hard about the target of the prescriptions and the recipients of the descriptions, right? And the beneficiaries of the corrections, right? So you have to think about your audience and who you're engaged with. And those are questions that dovetail very neatly with questions about the place of Black studies work in the academy, and that fold neatly into questions people in the academy are asking about, publicly engaged scholarship or public impact and all these kinds of things, right? And so all of this is kind of bound up together for me in ways I haven't quite disentangled yet. So I'll just tell you what I think I do, even when I'm not formally connected to a Black studies or Black studies cognate department. As I mentioned, my approach to philosophy, my interest in philosophy was launched and animated and sustained by my interest in Black life and the study of Black life, and an interest in the philosophical questions that arise from thinking about what it means to deal with Blackness and inhabit Blackness and embody it, perform it, and do all the things we do with it. There are ways to do that that tie into and build on and feed into familiar forms of academic scholarship and intellectual work, for which people are compensated in the ways we compensate professionals in certain institutional spaces, and that redound to their benefit as people who want to navigate those institutions. So there's that academic side of it. But there are all sorts of ways to make that work connect to the paths people traverse outside the academy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not giving a very good answer to this question. Now more than ever, in some ways, people who do the work we do are asked, just as a function of our jobs, to think about how our work connects to people outside the academy, because the reputation and standing of universities and higher ed institutions has in some ways never been lower than it is right now. We have to figure out how to sell ourselves and all that. So all of that's happening in a way anyway. And that's happening in the wake of aggressive efforts to institutionalize a place of back studies in professional settings where people are encouraged and rewarded, encouraged to legitimate their intellectual work in ways that are legible and cognizable to people in these institutions, right? So the professionalization of Black studies has happened at roughly the same moment as the decline in the value of professionalization in higher ed settings, in higher ed more broadly. And so we're having to navigate this very peculiar moment where these things are sort of going in different directions. All of which is to say it's very complicated. But it was complicated before we started Black Studies Department. It was complicated for Rayford Logan and Du Bois and Zora Neale Hurston and those folks, right? And so maybe I should have started with this. So I think about Weber and I think about professions and callings. I think about vocations, right? There's the profession of doing your academic work in a certain kind of way that gets you certain kinds of rewards and benefits. And then so there's the calling that led you to the work and that requires for some of us that we find a way to do the work of the work, sometimes in spite of the profession, right? That's just a cost of doing business in this way that for me is relevant to our work, almost irrespective of the condition or standing or status of the departments. That at a certain moment seemed like they could be a permanent locus for this work, and that other moments seem kind of unstable and uneasy, right? I'm rambling. Am I making sense? Am I making contact with your question at all?
I think absolutely, yeah. And I think that, there's something really interesting about I'm glad you brought this up. It hasn't come up very often in response to this question on the podcast about thinking about the change in how we imagine education sort of needing to have this, needing to have some sort of extra, outside the realm of thinking and the way that impacts something like character or judgment and these sorts of things, like Black studies coming in exactly at the time when this sort of, the idea of what an education is has really changed. But what I always think in terms of, how does it touch something outside the campus? I have this conversation all the time with colleagues and students and all kinds of people. I'm like, I live off campus too. And so do our students. And they go on to live, immensely varied lives. And so sometimes I think about the politics of what intellectual life is, the concrete politics that transform communities or, localities of any kind. We tend to have a kind of geography of that, of like you have to get off the campus, but we also, and I think that's fine to think about, what is community work and study, how do those relate? But there's always, as we all know, at a certain age, you start to have students come back in their 30s and 40s, and it's like, it turns out that they go on and lead these lives where we have slow boiled something in them, and they have like really shifted something about their corner of the world. And, conservatives understand that. That's why conservatives don't want Black studies to exist, or gender studies or ethnic studies to exist, because they know the political impact is in that transformation of something around judgment, whether it's cultural or political or, whatever. So all to say, no, for your response made perfect sense directly to the question. I think it raises these really important historical questions about Black studies coming about at the time when the university itself really changes. And then how does that impact how we even discern what's being expected sometimes of Black studies and on that Marable model? And you were right. This question is really formulated out of that Gates-Marable dispute. And it is my collaborator Ashley and I have talked about this, that when we first formulated this question, it felt like more of a tension than it does in now 2026. That the politics of just teaching Black texts, it turns out, is bordering on the criminal in some places.
Mm-hmm.
And so even that cleavage seems, that cleavage itself at a certain point seems almost ridiculous and decadent,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, sort of continuing with that, ask you about your own work. You've described it a bit, political theory, aesthetics, all animated really by philosophical sensibilities, which, as I said, I love. It's always great read, connect to it myself. And I think that kind of perspective is so important for the field of Black studies. It's not the centerpiece like history and literary history tend to be of the field. But I'm interested in how you think about your own work in relation to the field of Black studies historically. Like, where do you think it fits? You mentioned Du Bois and others, but also what boundaries do you think it pushes, or what new horizons do you see it opening up?
So I'll leave it to others to talk about how it fits, if anyone deigns to talk about my work in that connection. I, just trying to do the work. So let me put that differently. It's not up to me how it fits in terms of historical perspective, right? But it is up to me how I think it fits and how I want to try to make it fit, and what I think I'm building on, what I think I'm moving towards. And so I'm happy to talk about that. I just don't want it to make it sound like I'm putting myself in the pantheon or whatever.
Yes, I know. I like the way you put it there. That's exactly what I'm getting at.
So I mentioned that my journey to and through philosophy was animated by questions in what at least some of us would think of as Black studies, driven by an interest in some of the unavoidably philosophical questions that arise when you think about what racialization as Black looks like in certain kinds of settings, and what it means to try to build a life in a context in which this mode of racialization is doing any kind of work in relation to other attempts to, or other mechanisms for giving people resources for social identity formation, right, and positioning them in social landscapes. So in some ways, that was an extraordinarily unfortunate choice, a choice of philosophy, because philosophy, for most of its history and the forms that people in the English-speaking world recognized, didn't care about Black people. And when it did care about Black people, it cared about them in ways that made them resources for other people, right? And so a lot of what I've done, I'm very sorry to say, has involved what some feminist scholars used to describe as telling philosophers what people in other fields have already figured out.
Yes.
So this is the sort of corrective dimension of Black studies, right? Trying to do the kind of work to make certain understandings of racial formation visible in philosophy in a way that it wasn't when I was coming along. That's a battle people don't have to fight in the same ways anymore, and I'm grateful for that. We have people like Charles Mills and Linda Alcoff and others to thank for that. But a lot of my work, more than I would like, has been conducted in that spirit. And so the work that, if anything, gives me a claim to some kind of standing in or near Black studies, it's my book on Black aesthetics, which at the very beginning I describe as an attempt to build a bridge between Robert Brandom, who's one of the towering figures in certain forms of Anglophone philosophy, and Amiri Baraka, right? I wanted to do philosophy of art in part because for me, that was the world of aesthetic production or expressive production is in some ways, this is an obvious claim, in some ways the clearest space to look for, um, or the easiest place to find the most prominent expressions of Black identity or something like that, right? And so I wanted to think through what it meant, or simple resources to think responsibly about how aesthetic production, expressive culture work, especially in relation to Black life. And so I wrote this book to try to make room in philosophical aesthetics for the kinds of things that people in Black studies had been trying to do for a very long time. And my hope was that there would be some benefits would accrue to the work of Black studies by bringing philosophical resources to bear on questions like authenticity and the relationship between participation in certain kinds of aesthetic practices and racial identity formation and all of that. So again, another space in which unavoidably philosophical questions arise in the context and investigation of Black life or Black culture or Black experiences. And my hope was that there would be some value in bringing expressly philosophical resources to bear on that. Whether that does in fact redound to the benefit of Black studies work, I'll let Black studies people tell me. But it certainly seems to have been helpful in philosophy because it's easier now, not just because of my work, but because of people who were thinking similar thoughts to me, because of the work we've all done to try to build space for what some of us call critical race aesthetics work. Philosophy has, I think, benefited from that kind of work, which I'm honored to have been a part of. It's less clear to me how much of an impact that's made on the Black studies side. My hope is going forward to do more work that engages directly with people working on the Black studies side.
Well, what you said, of course it is always up to the reader to judge, or to, other communities to sort of place those things. But, I think what you said about your work and similar kind of work in philosophical circles on Black studies, the impact is hard to detect because the field is so dominated by historians, and increasingly, I think, by the sort of sociology side of social sciences, literature as well. But literary people, I think, tend towards a little bit more theoretical. But that philosophical dimension of the Black intellectual tradition continues to be just so examined and under theorized in Black studies. And that's, that's what I like as someone who left philosophy many years ago at this point. It's weird, 23 years ago, for Black studies, but also as, I'm pretty resolutely philosophical. The difficulty of pulling philosophy into the field is really, that's why I wanted to see how you imagine these kinds of things, because thinking about, Bramden and Baraka at the same time. I mean, to me, this is a totally thrilling pairing,
Mm-hmm.
but that making that philosophical dimension matter is, I think, is crucial to the future of the field. So, and whether that's Charles Mills or you, or, whatever else is coming up with, now I'm old enough to say, younger scholars,
Mm-hmm.
which is a phrase I never thought I'd use. Uh,
Right.
and maybe this is sort of walks up to something like an answer to this question. It's one of the last two questions I had for you. What you think that Black studies and study of Black life, what you think it has historically done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
So the question, it's a super interesting question. It puts me in mind of something I might have said in response to the first question when I invoked Marable and the sort of tripartite vision of what Black studies is or has been. Another way to think of that is that it has been, and at its best, models a form of critical social theory, right? Which is language people in philosophy have been using more and more over the last several years, right? Which draws from, for some people, the critical theory tradition of Frankfurt School or whatever it is, right? But for other people, comes directly from Du Bois or somebody like that. But it's a way of thinking about the work, the epistemological work of unveiling certain kinds of social formations that are bound up with the production and reproduction of oppression, right? And other kinds of untoward social arrangements, right? That kind of exercise, which unavoidably reaches across the town-gown divide, right? Because one of the things it does is subject the institutions that are committed to the work of knowledge production to critique, right? That kind of exercise is at the heart of Black studies, and Black studies at its best has done that extraordinarily well and modeled it and shown people what that can look like, right? What does it look like to build a kind of I think of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney talking about Black studies work as, or Black study as a kind of insurgent enterprise that's embedded in institutions that are constitutionally kind of opposed to it, but you kind of burrow in and smuggle resources out to other places, right?
Mm-hmm.
That way of thinking about the prospect of productive intellectual work in difficult social conditions, that's one of the towering achievements of Black studies at its best, right? People doing this work in the context of institutions that give certain kinds of resources and a little bit of space, but not a lot, but you figure out how to make room in those spaces to do things outside the spaces, right? That's Black studies at its best. And I'm extraordinarily grateful to have found a way to, even in some minimal way, be connected to that tradition and to be inspired by it, to think of ways to connect the work we do. And again, taking on board your efforts to sort of trouble the here and there, campus off campus dichotomy, but to take the things that happen inside these institutional spaces and make them work to the benefit of people for whom these institutions are not designed,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
That's Black studies at its best. And I think about that in connection with the things that happened around. Like, we do a good job of thinking about the periodically revisiting the enterprise, right? And these 30th anniversary and 40th anniversary things. What does it mean to do Black studies now, 40 years after 1968 or whatever it is, right? We have, by necessity, been open to and committed to a kind of ongoing re-examination of the work and the place of the work. And that's valuable. What has gone less well, I think, is the attempt to navigate the situation I tried haltingly and unevenly to describe a little while ago. The attempt to navigate the simultaneous evolution and development of Black studies as an as an enterprise, a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary, different people think of it different ways, enterprise, and the evolving condition of the higher ed setting in which that enterprise seems in some ways to be centrally located. What do I mean? For some people, and I count myself as one of these people at a certain moment, it seemed that the most important future for Black studies involved its thoroughgoing incorporation into the higher ed sector as a sort of beachhead, right? As a space from which the corrective, descriptive, and prescriptive work could flow out to other places, right? But for many of us who thought in this way, we hadn't yet thought carefully enough about what it meant to think of it that way in the wake of in the context of the sort of dying embers of the Cold War university, right? Where resources flowed to the university in certain kinds of ways. It was not fated to go that way forever. You had to think about what it was going to look like when resource allocation went differently, when the politics were different. I don't know that we've navigated that moment especially well. Some of that shows up in the debates that people used to have, and to some degree still have, about what it means to be an academic star and what stardom looks like in relationship to doing the work with integrity or something like that. Some of it shows up in debates about the kind of thing we've tried to talk about earlier in terms of what it means to do the work as an academic professional, as opposed to doing the work with a sense of calling that reaches outside the academic space, right? Shows up in different ways, but the unevenness with which we've faced, recognized, and grappled with the various evolutions that bear on the work, I'm not confident we've navigated that as well as we could have.
Fantastic response. I love that. There's so much to think about in what you just said. And I think this the relationship of Black studies to the shifting meaning of the university and education, but in terms of the university and resources and so forth. Um, it's just absolutely crucial set of questions, and they are just really difficult. It's like
Mm.
trying to write a history of the present in some ways, but also we now have, as you said, 1968, 40 years later. And then I did the math real quick, and I was like, 40 years after 1968 was 18 years ago. It's just
Mhm.
crazy. Now we have these accumulated years to kind of examine our present in light of some trajectory there in terms of the meaning of the university. And thinking about Black studies in relation to that, I think is difficult because I think it's still a very live fantasy of Black studies being outside the university.
Mm.
And, talking about Moten and Harney and many others, and just even the way resources do and priorities do flow at a university. Black studies tends to be, marginal in every case, and in some ways pushed, almost all the way out in others. Um, but at the same time, it's has this essential relationship to an institution that itself has to be understood, and that coexistence, I think, can be uncomfortable because there's something um, cleaner about being outside of it, but to also be inside it and outside it at the same time in ways that I've heard you articulate. It raises that historical question. So I'm all to say, I'm just really glad you brought this up and put it so directly and clearly. Make this podcast episode worthwhile, 1,000 times, just simply for that, in addition to this other stuff. So.
Very kind of you to say. Very
It's
kind.
and maybe that's already part of an answer to the last question I had for you, which is thinking in a Black studies context. What do you th- what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or what's the question you would want us to all be asking?
Oh, well, so this goes back in a way to something I was tempted to say in response to the last question. Another thing I think we've done well, or that has gone well, is the ongoing attempt to think about the Blackness of Black studies in responsible relationship to other categories of social differentiation, right, or other axes of social differentiation, right? So you think about the way um, the thought that African American studies or Black studies cognate fields were essentially in some way organized just around race, and race has to be imagined to the exclusion, perhaps provisional, but to the exclusion of other kinds of things. That's kind of gone away. People, for a while, that was a hard battle to fight, and that maybe just means I'm old, but one of the achievements of the last couple, like 15 years or so at least, of Black studies work, maybe longer, 20 years, is the difficulty, right, the how hard it is to even motivate those kinds of questions anymore now, right? The intersectionality debates have been settled, and people know that Blackness is not just Blackness, and Blackness is a mode in which class and gender and all that other stuff is lived. So that's one of the achievements. And it is also, however, one of the things we have to keep asking about, right? Because one of the intersectional realities that has a couple of those intersectional conditions have been less carefully taken on board, and those had to do with um, class and geopolitics, right? And people talk a
Mhm.
lot about diaspora,
Yeah.
but it is important to think about the way Black studies work takes class politics seriously and takes seriously the relationship between class politics and unfolding modes of geopolitics. Um, Especially in a moment in which all sorts of things are up for grabs in ways that some people, perhaps too optimistically, thought they would never be up for grabs again. So you mentioned a little while ago that, certain modes of Black study, like boring forms of Black study, like, Black history and basic obvious forms, are being literally criminalized in various, locations around the country. That kind of thing makes it crucial that we think with care about the political developments that make those kinds of shifts possible. And those political developments are not just about anti-Blackness. They are crucially about anti-Blackness, but they're about all sorts of other things too. And it's important to be able to think those things together and to think about the way those things connect to dynamics that are not limited to American national politics. And they're not limited to what some of us still think of as identity politics. This is very complicated terrain, and we have to think about complicated things in complicated ways and find ways to talk about the complexities clearly, which I'm failing at, but, I'm motivating the problem at least. This is the kind of thing I think about. And this is why I think I said at the beginning of our conversation, I'm not sure I don't have settled views on this, because on the things that we're meant to talk about today, because responsible inquiry in relation to social problems begins with clarifying your sense of what's going on. And I'm still trying to decide how I want to think about a lot of that. And some of that is a function of the way knowledge formation happens now, and happens at a different pace by appeal to different kinds of resources, which is why I end up where I tried to end up a second ago, right? That there are complexities in play that require engaging a complex world without the crutches of artificial simplification. So again, I'm not sure I'm making contact with your question. Tell me if I am.
No, absolutely. I was just about to say, this is such a fantastic place to wrap up. I mean, thinking about the demands for new kinds of characterizations and new kinds of languages around taking, I like the way you walked into it, taking the insights of understanding intersections of race, of gender, of class, of nation. Like, taking that insight seriously is going to lead us into places where we don't have a habitual vocabulary and habitual set of characterizations, or even, as you were saying, even like, what is the right question to ask? And I love that as a challenge. I will say, this is being proud and provincial, but I think this is where philosophers actually excel. So I think philosophers, not the institution of philosophy, but
Yes.
in terms of the attentiveness to complex questions, and the difficulty of asking the question itself. And
Yeah.
so
I hope you're right. This is why it's important, again, to distinguish the profession from the vocation, right? I think of,
please, yes.
you say philosophers, I think of Claudia Jones and C.L.R. James and Du Bois, right? Expressly philosophical thinkers who give us resources for navigating moments like this, who are only beginning their journey through the profession of philosophy, having become recently visible to philosophers in certain kinds of way, card-carrying philosophers.
Yes.
So, point taken.
Card carrying indeed. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Paul. I was really looking forward to it. It's well beyond what I was even hoping. So this is a wonderful contribution to the series. I appreciate your time, but I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and insights across this. Thank you so much.
You're very kind, man. I appreciate your patience with my halting reflections.
Hey, it's the philosophical way.
All right.
All right. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.
You do the same, man. Be well.
All right, bye.